Hey, what's up YouTube? My name is Brett Westwood, and today we are going to create a fully functional login and register page using the MERN stack. So that means we're going to use MongoDB for the database. We're going to use Express, React, and node.js. We are also going to use Bcrypt so we could hash passwords inside of the database. And we're going to use JSONWebToken so we could track the user throughout the website with the cookie. We're going to do this using create context from React, and we're also going to use the package React Hot Toast, which gives us professional looking notifications when there's an error on either the server side or client side. So before we get started, if you can, hit that like button and also subscribe to the channel for more content similar to this, and let's get started. So right on the screen we are going to use the vite app, so vite.js.dev. But before we do that, we are going to go on my desktop and we're going to create a brand new folder, and we are going to call this MERN auth. We're just going to press enter. We're going to open up our text editor, which is VS Code, and I'm going to drag and drop the folder we just created. I'm going to make it full screen so you can see. And we have an empty folder, and we're going to create two main folders inside of this folder. First one, we are going to have client, which is going to be our front end. Second, we are going to have server, which is going to be our backend. So we're going to go inside of the client side folder first. So we're going to open up this terminal by pressing Control backtick. We're going to cd into the client. Go back to Vite's documentation, click Get Started, and we're going to use the node package manager since I'm using npm. Copy that. We're going to paste the command there, and we're going to do it inside the same directory with just a period. We're going to answer the questions about the framework. We're using React. We're using JavaScript. And now it's telling us that we have to run npm install, then npm run dev to run the development server. So npm install to install all the dependencies that we need for the specific application. And then after this, we are just going to do npm run dev. This is going to open up on localhost 5173. You could press Control and click. We could open this up. I'm going to zoom back out to 175%. And as you can see, everything looks to be working. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside of the client folder, and we are going to organize these folders and make sure everything looks nice and ready to go. So when you do have a vite app, this is what it's going to look like. You're going to have a package JSON, a config file. You're going to have a source file, and this is where all your code is going to usually be in. So we have a main file, which we could keep as is. And the app.jsx is the code that creates the UI for this. So we're just going to remove all the code and leave the fragment. And we could just do an H1 saying hello. We can remove the count state, and then we can remove the logo and use state, and we'll keep the app CSS. So as you can see, it says hello with the index CSS that's already applied to it in the app CSS. Okay, next thing I want to do is I'm going to create a few folders. I'm going to create folders inside the source. I'm going to create a components folder. And inside the components folder, we're going to have a navbar. And I'm going to use the ES7 snippets, and I'm just going to press RFC. You could get the snippets in the extensions by pressing ES7. I'll expand this out a little bit, and it's going to be this one right here. So you could download that, and you'll be able to easily type in functions whenever you need. So we have a functional component right here for navbar. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create another directory inside source, and we're going to call this pages. We're going to have 3 pages. We're going to have a home.jsx RFC, a register.jsx, not new folder, new file, and a login.jsx. And this will be RFC, and then the register RFC. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I'm going to install 2 node package managers. So like packages that we need on the front end client. So I'm going to open up another terminal here, cd into the client. And those 2 packages I want is going to be React Router DOM. So npm install React Router DOM. And this just allows us to route to different pages, making our application multi-page. And we're going to do Axios, which is a package that allows us to connect the front end to the backend API endpoints. So we're just going to press enter, make sure you're in the client. We could just confirm by going to the package JSON. We have both dependencies there. Let me close up a few files here. And we are going to go firstly inside the main folder. So we need to wrap our whole application with the browser router. And this browser router, we're going to name it as router. I think I spelled it wrong. Yeah. So browser router as router from React Router DOM. And I spelled from wrong. Okay. So we're going to wrap the whole app with the router. So let's move this here. So this allows us now to use routes and route inside of our application. So now we're going to go to the app.jsx, remove this h1 that we had, and we are going to import a few things here. So we're going to import routes and route from React Router DOM. Okay, so we are going to have all the routes inside of the routes. And if we want something to be static on a page, on like the top of every page, like a navbar, we are not going to put the navbar inside of routes. Same thing with like a footer. You're not going to put the footer inside of routes. It's not a route. But we do need a parent element. So we're going to keep this fragment here, and we're going to have a navbar. And inside this navbar, we have to import it. So let me make sure it's working. So it's not working as import, so that's fine. Sometimes it does that, but inside the routes, that's where we're going to have each route. And it's going to take on 2 properties, a path, which the first path we're going to do is just a /, which means that it's going to be the home page. And then we need an element, which is going to be the pages. So this page is the home page. And it's not auto importing, so I'm actually going to close this up and then reopen it. So just give me 1 sec, because it should be auto importing as I go. So I'm just going to close this. And I'm going to open it back up, and we're going to try it again. And it looks like it's not. Let me just make sure I exported it then. It is exported. And now we're in the app, so we just got to import these now manually, which is fine. It's just more work. So we got to import navbar from // source / components / navbar. Okay. And now we got to import home. Import home from / pages / home. And then now we're going to copy and paste the route down twice, and we're going to have a register route, and then we're going to have a login route, and then the elements are going to be corresponding with those routes. Okay, so there's the auto import. I don't know why it just started working, but there's the register, auto imports it, and login auto imports. So it makes it a lot quicker and easier, as you can see, but if you can't, you're just going to do it manually. So we're going to make sure everything looks good right now. Let's just inspect. Is our development work? Oh, it's not running because I restarted the server. So we're going to cd into the client, and then we're going to run npm run dev. No. Okay. Let me just pull this over here. Zoom in at 200%. If we do go to /login, it should just say login. And then the navbar is static on every page. Perfect. All right, now we want to start working with the nav bar. And you can remove the React from React. We don't need that. So for nav bar, we're just going to import the link from React router DOM. Let's remove everything inside the return. Use HTML syntax of nav. And then inside of that, we are going to have 3 links. We're going to have to property, and this to property is going to be the endpoint that we're going to on the front end. So it's going to be home, and then we'll copy it down 3 times. We're going to have register, and then login, and then just name these whatever the endpoints are. Or routes, however you want to call it. And then as you can see, now we could go to each page by using a navigation bar. Cool. Next thing I want to do is I want to create the register and login page. So register, we could start with first. We use the div as the parent element. We'll have a form. Inside the form, we're going to have 3 inputs for the register. We're going to need their name, we want their email, and we want their password. So we're going to have a label. This will be name. We're going to have an input, and it's going to be a self-closing tag. The input is going to take 2 properties for now. We're going to have the type, which is text for this one. And we're going to have a placeholder, which is going to just say enter name ... Now I'm just going to copy and paste the label and input down twice. And then change what I need. So this is going to be email. This will be password. This type is going to be email. And this type will be password. And then change the placeholders as well. Don't forget that. And then after the last input, we're going to create a button. And this button is going to say submit. And then we're just going to add the type as text. But I think by default, the button inside of a form, or not text, it's going to be submit. And the button by default should be submit. But just in case it's not, we're just going to add that. It's not going to hurt. And now the on submit at the top, we need to create a function that's going to handle this submission. So we are going to call this register user. And then we need to create this function above the return. So we're just going to create an arrow function. And this arrow function is going to take in an event property, which I already know it's going to do. And then when we do type in this, and when we do submit this button, we don't want the page to automatically reload. So we're going to have this event.prevent default. So I think everything looks good. There's our form right there. Looking good. Now we're just going to copy and paste the email and password because that's all we need for the login. So we're going to now go to the login, have the div as the parent element, create a form, copy and paste by just email and password. And then we're going to have a button as well, which is just going to say login. We'll give it a type of submit. Well, not type of. Type is going to be submit. And the form is going to have an on submit. And this function we're going to say is login user. And we are going to create this function. So const login user. It's an arrow function. e.prevent default. And then we're going to pass in the event. Not export, event. Okay. Next thing I want to do is I do want to create state now for the register and login. So I'm going to go back to the register. We are going to import useState. That's going to be the first thing from React. And I like putting the state right below the function where we're going to have the state. And this state, we're going to create an object called data and set data. And it's going to equal an initial value of an object with 3 parameters. These 3 parameters are going to be the inputs. So we're going to have a name, which is going to be empty string, email, which is an empty string, and password, which is an empty string. You could do it separately if you want, but this is just how we are going to do it. So now that we have the state at the top here, we need to implement it inside of these inputs. So these inputs are going to have a value, and they're also going to have an onChange. So the value is going to equal data dot and then the name. So the object and then whatever the property is. So data dot name, and the onChange is going to be an arrow function, anonymous function. And for that anonymous function, it is going to look a little different than you're used to, especially if you're just doing like name and set name or email and set email. We are going to pass in the event, and this is going to equal an arrow function of set data, which allows us to change the data value of whatever the property is. And then this is going to be an object. Remember, we're changing the value of an object, which is data. So it has to look like this. So we need the object. And then the syntax we're going to have is we're going to have the spread operator. So we're going to have all the data, comma, and then we're just changing the name to e.target.value. So that's how it's going to look here. And I could just copy and paste this down 2 more times. And then change what I need. So this is going to be data.email. This will be data.password. Set data is fine. We're just going to change this right here. This will be email. And then this will be password. And we're also going to test out to make sure we're receiving the state by using React DevTools. So we have that for now. We're going to go in the login, import use state from React, const data set data equals use state. Initial value is going to be email, empty string, and then password, empty string. And these are empty strings because the initial value, when you go on this form, there's not going to be anything on it. So that's why it's empty string and not the previous information that the user typed in. Okay, so now we just need to add the value on and the onChange on each input. So this is going to be email, and then add it to this input as well. Password, and then password. And everything looks good. So let's just test out the states real quick on the front end. Let me refresh, see if we have any errors in the console. We do not, so we look pretty good. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stay in the console. I'm gonna go to a tab called Components from React DevTools. I am on the register page. I'm gonna click register right here. And you can see right here that we have 3 different states, name, email, password. And as I type, they should change. So I'm gonna type my name, Brett, and it says Brett. Let me do email, brett@gmail.com, and then password 12345. So it looks like the state is working. Let's just check in the login page real quick. brett@gmail.com, and then 12345. And there's the state for the login. So it looks like everything is working correctly. So we are good with this front end for now. I will style it off screen because I don't care about talking about the CSS on screen, just about the functionality of using MERN for this application. So let's just X out of all these pages for now. And we are going to close the client, and we are going to open a new terminal. We are going to cd into the server, and we're just going to say npm init. This is going to initialize like a node package model, like a package JSON file. So the package name is going to be server, versions 1, description. And as you can see, it says entry point is index.js. So that's going to be the file that's going to be our main entry point for the backend. And you can just press enter for the rest of these. And as you see in the server, we have a package JSON. Perfect. Next thing we might as well just do real quick is create a new file called index.js as the entry point. And then there's a few packages I do want to install before we get started. and it's going to be the main packages we need for the backend. So we're going to install Express, which is the framework. We're going to install NodeMon, which is going to pretty much update the server to make sure we have no errors, and it'll tell us right away if we do. We are going to have .env, which allows us to use environment variables inside of our backend application and hide whatever secret keys or strings that we want hidden from the public. And we are also going to have cores because we need to connect our localhost 5173, which is our front end, and our back end we're going to have as localhost 8000. If we don't do cores, it's going to give you a course error, which means you can't connect the two different hosts because it's like a security issue. We are just going to press enter for that. Make sure you're in the server. Awesome. Now the next thing we are going to do is we're going to set up some of the index.js file. So to do that, we got to import Express from Express. And it is in this syntax. I think this is like ES6 or something. This is older school syntax. You can change it, but you just got to do a few more steps inside of your application. But you might as well do this. This isn't too hard. So I'll just recommend sticking to this. We could do the .env and then require .env, and then we also have to have a .config. And then we also have cores, which we might use cores in a different file, but we could just keep it here for now. Require cores, and then we just have to initialize Express. So const app equals Express. That's what most people do, especially on your entry level point. And the other thing I want to do is I want to go inside the package JSON and create another script file. So I'm going to have a comma underneath scripts, and we're going to have it called start. And then it's just going to be nodemon index.js. That means it's just going to watch the index.js file. And all we have to do is type in npm start. If you don't do this, you just got to type in nodemon index.js. But this just makes it simpler. So npm start. And as you can see, is launching the node index.js file. So we can close the package JSON file up. And the next thing is I'm going to set up a port so we can listen on. And this is just usually at the bottom of the entry level file. So we're going to have a const port. And like I said, we're 8000. And then we have a function that's associated with Express called listen. And that means we're going to listen to the port with an anonymous function that calls a console log. And we're going to have backticks. And we're going to say server is running on port. And then we're going to do the syntax, and the port is going to be whatever the port is, so 8000. So this console log in an Express server should not show up on the front end. It's just going to show up in your terminal log. And as you can see here, it says server is running on port 8000 and everything looks good. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to get more organized with these folders because we're going to have a lot more code in this backend. So what we're going to do is we're going to create two folder structures right now, directories inside of the server. First one we need routes. Because we are creating API endpoints, we need routes. So we're going to create a routes folder, and inside of that routes folder, we just need one file called auth routes.js. You can name this whatever you want, but I'm just going to name that for now. And then we're going to have another folder called controllers. And what controllers are pretty much the functions that are associated with each endpoint. So that's where most of the code is going to be. That is actually going to do a lot of the logic. So auth controllers or controller.js. So now we have our backend set up more. And the very next thing I want to do is I just want to test a GET request endpoint with the API and Axios to make sure everything is working correctly. Okay, so to create a GET request endpoint, we are going to start inside of routes. So in the routes, we have a file called authroute.js, and we need to import Express. And then after we import express, we are not going to initialize it with app. We actually are going to initialize it with router. So router equals, and then it's going to be express dot router. And as you can see, it auto completes for you. And this is just a function that we're allowed to use with the express framework. So this allows us to use this router inside of our routes folder. Another thing we need is we need course. So we definitely need it in this file because we do want to make sure we could connect a different host, even if it's different API endpoints with different hosts. And for that, we just might as well create some middleware real quick with that course. So it's going to be router.use. So that means the router is going to use course, and course is going to have an object with 2 parameters, and we're going to have credentials as true. And then we need to define the origin, which is going to be your front end, which is http://localhost, and it was 5173 if you're using the Vite app. There is some front ends that are localhost 3000. You just got to play around with it depending on what you used. So there is our middleware for our router. And the syntax for router down here is we're going to use router dot, and then you can see all the properties and stuff it gives you right here. But we're calling a GET request. So we're going to say GET. And then we need the endpoint as the first parameter, which we could just do slash because this is just a test. And then after, you could either create the request response, and then you could write whatever you want here. But if you want to make it the code more clean and organized, we actually are just going to call this function's name, which we are going to make it as test. So we don't have test actually defined yet, but we will inside of the controllers. And then all we have to do is we have to export it. So make sure you always export. And this is how you export files inside of an Express framework. So it's module.exports, and then we're exporting the router. Okay. So we're exporting the router, and we have to go to the entry point, which is the index.js. So for this, we did initialize it with app, so we need to use app.use. And this is just going to be a /. So we want all the routes to go to a /, and then inside of the auth routes, this is actually going to define the actual route that we want. So this / is perfect, and this / could be used for all of the routes. And then we have to import that export from the auth routes. So all we have to do is press require, and then we have to go inside of routes / auth routes. So now our routes are connected, and we are getting an error. And as you can see, it says test is not defined, and it's talking about this. So now let's define test inside of the auth controller. So I'm just going to go down 3 lines for now, and I'm just going to say const test equals request response, and it's going to be an arrow function that has those 2 parameters. And all we have to do for this is we just have to return some JSON. So we're going to have a res.json, and we can put test is working. And the main reason we are testing to make sure endpoints are working is because we don't want to be working on endpoints and code in the backend and then trying to figure out where the problem is. It's just better to test stuff beforehand and then start working your way up from there. It does take a little more time, but it's a better way to do it. So we have that for there. And all we need to do now is we have to export it from this file. Exports equals, and we're going to be exporting a few things from this file. So that's why I have an object right there, and we're going to have test. And it still says test is not defined is because now we have to import it on the top. So const and then test with the curly braces because we're going to be defining multiple functions there. And this is going to be from controllers / auth controller. And if we scroll down, everything looks like it's running good. Now we just have to work on our front end code so they both could connect and we could actually test that GET request endpoint. So let me just do a quick review of what we just did. So we ran in the auth controller. We created a function called test, with the request and response, and we are sending back a response JSON of test is working. And then we exported it. We imported it into the router, and then we used it down here as a function inside of router.get to this endpoint. And then we exported it again, router, to our entry level file, and then we just used it here, app.use. So the only thing we have to do now is I'm going to close these up real quick. We could collapse the server folder. We're going to open the client, and we could do this all inside of our login page. So if we go to our login page, we are now going to be working inside the login user function. So that means if we click this button, the login user function is going to fire off some code. So for this, all we have to do is make sure we import Axios. So we're going to do that first. You can do a fetch request, but we're going to use Axios for this specific project. Axios is very easy to use. And all you're going to do here is call axios.get. And then this is where you can make your life a lot simpler. So instead of typing out localhost, blah, 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 like your base URL, we are going to use Axios properties and make sure we use that in our app.jsx. So when I start typing it, you're going to understand it a lot better. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios inside of our app.jsx file. And then right above the function app, we are going to have an axios.defaults.base URL. And this base URL is going to be our backend URL, which is going to be http://localhost 8000. So that means we don't have to keep typing it in on every endpoint we do. We just got to type in the endpoint, the very end. So /register/login, or just like a slash if it's the home. And then we're going to also do one more thing, Axios defaults dot with credentials. And we're going to have that set to true. So we're going to make sure we could actually connect to this localhost 8000, and we're giving us pretty much the credentials to actually work with it. So axios.get, and we're going to have a slash. So it looks like everything should be working. Now we're actually going to test it, and I'm going to show you a different way you could also test as well without doing course. So I'm going to go on my page or application, and we're going to be on the login page. We're going to open up our DevTools, and we're going to open up a network tab, and we're going to see what it does. So all you got to do is just click login, and we get a 200 status, which isn't actually an OK status. The request method is get, and the request URL we're requesting from is the localhost 8000 with a slash, and that is our backend. And if you look at the response, it is test is working. So it looks like everything is working perfectly. Another thing you could do to test is you could use Postman, and you could test your endpoints there. You just make sure you go into workspace. I can open up a new tab. Make sure your backend is running before you even do this. And then you're going to have localhost 8000 / a get request. And then we're just going to send the data, and it says test is working. So that's another way to test your endpoint to make sure everything is good. But like I said, you're not using course, and course is essential if you're actually creating a real application. Okay, we can leave that. And now we're going to close everything up, and we are going to go back inside of our code. And the next thing we're actually going to be doing is we could actually set up MongoDB before we even do anything else. So we can have the database set up and ready to go. So all you have to do is I'm going to open up a Google Chrome, new tab, and you can go on google.com and you can just type in MongoDB. So MongoDB is part of the MERN stack, and it is a database that we are going to use to store all of our users' information. It's very simple to use, and this should not even take you more than 5 minutes to set up. So all you gotta do is log into your account. You could either use Google, GitHub, or with the email address and password. I am just going to use Google. I am going to log in. And if you are signing up for a new account with the email and password, you might have to answer a few questions. But if you're not, you should land on a page that looks very similar to this. Right here at the top left, we are going to click this MERN YT1. That's what it says for me, but it might say new project for you if you don't have any projects. For me, I get a down arrow and I get a bunch of projects that I've created in the past, and then I get this new project. I click that, and now we're going to name our project. So we can name this MERN auth. Next page, it's going to say add members and set permissions. You could just click create project, and now it's just going to take a few seconds for it to load up. Now we're going to create a database within this project called MERN auth. We are going to use the free version, which is for learning and exploring MongoDB in a cloud environment. You only get 512 megabytes of storage. We're going to use the AWS provider, and you should use your recommended region, which whenever one has the star. And mine is the North Virginia since I'm on the East Coast. And you should change your cluster name to whatever you want, but this isn't actually public to the client. I'm just going to leave it as is and click create. Okay, so pretty much the most important part of creating MongoDB is creating this username and password. So I'm going to have bwestwood11, and this password, you can make it whatever you want, but I am just going to use what they already gave me. I'm going to open up a notepad on my computer, and I'm going to paste it there. You do not want to forget this password, because if you do, you won't be able to finish actually connecting MongoDB to your application. So all we're going to do is click create user. We're going to use our local environment, and if you obviously want a more advanced way, you could use a cloud environment if it's a bigger project, but this should do. And then add entries to your IP address. Make sure you just enter your IP address, and then other than that, you could finish and close and go to your database. This is going to take a little bit of time to load, so we are going to just minimize this page here. We are going to close everything in this front end real quick, and we are going to go inside of our index.js and start connecting Mongoose. First thing, MongoDB. There's a precursor right there. So we are going to use Mongoose package to connect MongoDB. So we can open up a new terminal, cd into the server, and we're going to install Mongoose into our server. So now this package is installed into our server. Now we need to import it at the top of our index.js file. So we're going to import Mongoose, and then we're going to require Mongoose. Okay, so Mongoose gives us a few properties that we can use as functions, and one of them is going to be connect. And I'm just going to put a comment here, and I'm just going to put database connection. So we're connecting our database to our application, and then here is the parameter where we're going to have a string. So I'll show you exactly what we need now from MongoDB. So mine is still loading, which is totally fine. Next thing we could do is we could create an env file inside of the server. So all you gotta do is just go on the root layer of your server file and press .env, and there's your .env file. And the env file we're gonna have is called mongo_url. And we are gonna get this string, which needs to be hidden from MongoDB database. You do not want to share the string with anybody. Sometimes it takes a long time to load the cluster, sometimes it doesn't. So mine still says loading, but it looks like we could connect our application. So you just press connect here, and then it's going to pop up this. Make sure you have this version or later. You do not have to do the second part because we're doing Mongoose. And we're just going to copy this string here and paste it into the env file. So we back out, we paste the string, and if you see inside the string, it says password inside of these like two greater than and less than signs. We need to use that password that I saved earlier and just paste it in here. Because if you don't do this, you're not going to be able to connect successfully to your MongoDB database. So now we have this string. We go back to our index.js file, And to access that, we're going to do process.env.mongo_URL. And then we're going to do some console logs to see if we're actually connected. So we can do a then and catch. So for the then, we're going to console.log. So if it's true, we're going to console log database connected. And then we're going to do a catch. Console.log data database not connected. And then we also want to give the error, which we have to pass in as a parameter as well. And then another thing you want to do before testing your connection out is, since we did make changes to an env file, you should reset the server. So we are just going to reset the server real quick. And all you got to do is press Control-C and then press npm start. And as you can see, server is running on port 8000. So we're running, and it says the database is connected. So that means we have successfully connected MongoDB to our application. Next thing I want to do real quick to get out of the way is we want to create a user schema. So that means we want to define the types that our user implements inside of the register form. So let me just check real quick to see if our cluster is done, and it is done. So there we go, perfect. So our cluster is done. I'm just going to tally back to our application, our front end. And now we're going to create another folder inside server, and we're going to call this models. And then we are going to create a file inside of models called user.js. And this, like I said, we're going to find types of what they enter. So mongoose, we're just importing mongoose at the top. And then we are going to use a property that mongoose gives us called schema. And that is going to equal mongoose. And they do have documentation for all of this on their website. So if you do want to learn more about it, I recommend going there. Or you could ask ChatGPT and it'll probably tell you as well. But we are going to create a new schema, and it's going to have an object. And this object is going to have those three values that we are looking for when somebody registers. This is the stuff we're going to store inside of the database. So we have a name, which is going to be a string. We're going to have an email, which is also going to be a string. And the string has to be capital S. And then we also want the email to be unique, which is set to true. And then the password, we can make it a string. So now we just have to define where we want this user model in our database. So mongoose.model. We want it inside of a user collection. And what we want to put inside of this user collection is the user schema, which is right here, that takes all of these into account. And then we just have to export it, module.exports, because we're going to have to use this later inside of our controllers. There we go. So we just successfully connected our database, and we created some user schemas as well. So we already have that out of the way. We could close the env file, the models, close all these up. We already tested our get endpoint to make sure everything is working. And now the next step I want to do is I want to start creating our post request, which is we're going to have two. We're going to have a login and a register post request, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so to get started on our post request, I like to start in the routes. So we need a new route for this, and this is a post. So it's going to be router.post. And we want to define the endpoint. So the endpoint we want to do first is register. We want to work in order that somebody's actually going to come through our website. So somebody registers before they log in. So I like to start on the register first. And then here, like I said, we are going to call our function, which should be relatable, which is register user. It crashed because register user is not defined. And we are going to define register user inside of our controllers. So we might as well just do that now. So we can leave the test as is. And then we're going to have a const register user. And it is going to take in a request response. And we can just leave that for now. And then we are going to export register user, go back in the routes, and make sure it's imported as well. So register user. So we don't get any errors. So let me just make sure we have no errors. Yeah, it looks like, yeah, we have no errors. So database is connected, server is running, awesome. And you can just do this. It should do it, there we go. So database is connected and everything is running properly. So now we are gonna work inside of our controller. So this is where all the magic happens for the API endpoints in the backend. So what we are going to do here is we have to think about what we're getting and what we want to check and all the good stuff. So for this, I'm going to create a try catch block. And let me just create that real quick. So we have a try catch. And the very first thing is we want to take in the request body. But we also need to add a middleware if we ever take in request body, because we need to parse the data so we could actually accept that requested information. So let me just define the requested body of what we're going to be taking in, which is name, email, and password. And that is going to equal the request.body. And like I said, we need a middleware or this information is going to give us an error. So we wanted the middleware inside of our index.js, which is the entry level application for our backend. So let's just do a comment, say middleware. It'll be app.use express.json, which parses the data. And it cannot access app. And it says cannot access app before initialization. Reason why is because I initialized it below. It should be initialized at the top. And we get that error taken care of. That should be the only middleware we need for now. If not, we'll come back to it and fix it when needed. But we are going to go inside of our auth controller again. And we have the requested body. So we have this information that comes in to the requested body. And what I want to do after this is I want to do a few checks. So this is where our front end and back end is really going to play an important role. We're going to do checks to make sure everything is working correctly. So check if name was entered. So that's what the first thing I want to do. So I want to make sure they actually typed in their name, because if they didn't, we should throw an error at them. So to do that, we're just going to say if there is no name, we are going to return a response.json of error, and then name is required. Reason why I'm writing it like this is because we're going to access this error later on inside of our client folder here. I'm going to minimize the client as well so everything looks cleaner. So we have that set up. Everything's good. Now I want to do another check. I want to check if password is good. And we are going to do two checks here. So we're going to say if there's no password, so if they didn't type in password, or the password dot length is less than 6, then we need to throw out them an error, because we want them to give us a strong password for our application. So we're going to return response.json. It's going to be an object with an error. And then we're going to say for this error, password is required and should be at least 6 characters long. So that should be it for the password check. Now the reason why we did the MongoDB database and made sure everything was working correctly is because now we want to check the email and make sure nobody else has used that email to sign up for our application. So we're just going to say check email. And for this, we're going to say if it exists. Well, we're not going to say if it exists. Let me rephrase that. So we're going to have a variable or a function that equals exist. And we're going to need to use async and await for this. Reason why is because it is an asynchronous function to request data from a database. It is not instantaneous, and it's not in our code, so we need to async await it. And then also, I didn't import that user, like the user schema. So it's not import. So what I need to do here is I need a const. Now I'm going to call it with a capital U. User equals require and then we're just going to that models, the schema that we created, and we're going to take out the user. And for this, we are going to be able to use a property called user.findOne. This means it is going to try to find one of whatever parameter we put in, which is going to be email. So we are going to find if this email is in our database. So that's what it means. So if this exists is true, that means there is an email that was found in our schema, which is our database. So if that is the case, if exists is true, which that's what it means, we are going to return a response.json object saying error email is taken already. So they should get that message if they type an email that's already been typed in. And the other thing we have to do is we are going to create the user in the database now. So to do that, MongoDB gives us a property called create, where we could just tag it on to user. And to create this, we just want name, email, and password. And just a heads up, we are sending a password that isn't hashed yet, but we will do it later on. So we're going to send a password that actually gets hashed. So it looks like we've done all the checks and we created the user in the database. And we are just going to return a response.json user. We're just going to return that user. Okay. So that, and then also let's do a console.log and the catch. We could just do error. So there's our try catch, and our register user endpoint looks pretty good for now. Like I said, we just need to hash the password later. We will get to that. There's our route using that endpoint and that function. Just making sure everything looks good. And then we use it here. Okay. So we could just go on our client side now, go onto the register page. And on the register page, now we need to connect to that endpoint in our backend. So to do that, we're going to need to destructure the data first. So let's destructure it by saying const name, email, and password equals data. And then after this, we want a try catch block as well, just to make sure we catch any errors if we do any errors. So we're going to have a const data. So this data that's destructured is going to equal await. So if we use await here, we must use a sync up here. We use await Axios, and we don't have Axios imported. So let me import that. Axios, and then it's a post request, so dot post, and the endpoint is register. And then the next parameter is, after this, we have to send a payload, which is going to be the information, so name, email, and password. So this is the information again sent to the backend. And now those errors that we checked in the backend, so if there's like no name, if the email is taken, we want to showcase that on the front end. And the way we do that is we have to install a package. So let me just go to Google real quick. And this package is called React Toast. And it's React Hot Toast. I'll go to the documentation and I'm going to tell you how to implement this into your app. So we're using the Node package manager. So we're going to copy this. We are going to cd into the client, install this package, and then we're also going to have to now go inside of our main folder, which our main folder that we're going to consider for this is going to be the app.jsx, and we're going to import toaster from React Hot Toast. This is pretty much just us importing browser router as a router for the React router DOM, but for React Hot Toast. So I am going to implement toaster right below the nav bar. And this is going to be a self-closing tab, and it's going to have a few properties. So the first property we want to define is position. Excuse me. All right, so position means where do we want our notifications on the user side to appear. So we could do this bottom right. And then we are going to have toast options. In these toast options, this is where we're going to have another object, and we're just going to define the duration. And this duration we're going to have as 2000, which means 2 seconds. It's going to last for 2 seconds, the notification. You can go through their documentation, as you can see here. It's pretty simple to follow, and you could just, if you want to learn more, you can do that. But this is pretty much the basis of how you set it up. Now we are going to go inside the register, right? And then we're going to import toast. I think it actually has brackets, it does. Import toast from React Hot Toast. Okay, so now after we send the payload, that is now where we're going to do the checks, and that's how we're going to access it. So we named every checked error inside of an object. So we're going to say if there is a data.error, so if there is an error with the data that we define in the backend, we are going to do a toast.error, and then we're going to pass in that data.error message. And that data.error message, just to get a refresher real quick, is right here. So if this data, which is email, is an error, we're going to get an error, which is email is taken already. So we have that if, and then we could do an else statement. So else, if everything looks right, we want to set the data on the user side to an empty object. So we're going to reset the input fields. We also want to send a success message to let them know, hey, you were successful. So we could say login successful, welcome. And then we also want to navigate them to a different page. And we could use the use navigate from React Router DOM. And then all we have to do is initialize that. So I'm going to initialize it with navigate as the variable, and then use navigate and invoke that function. So there we go. So navigate, use navigate. And then after we send that message, we want to navigate, and we could just say to the login page, for example. Reason why is because after they register, we want them to log in, or you could send them to the home page. Doesn't matter to me. And then other than that, we just want to put something in the catch just to see. So console.log, and then we'll console log the error. So everything looks pretty good for the register API endpoint that we made. So we are going to test it out now. And if there's any errors, we will debug them. So let me open up our front end application. Go to register. Let's just make sure we have no errors. So console, we have no errors. We could go to the network tab, and let me just make sure we have no errors in our server, and we have none there too. Okay. And if we want to see our user in our database, all you gotta do is click browse collections after we submit our information. So we'll see if that actually works as well too. So we're gonna have the name Brett, email will be brett@gmail.com, and the password is 12345 6, and we'll do 6. So this should work, and then we'll also try different ones like passwords less than 6 characters, no name, same email, to make sure all those error messages work. So we'll click submit. We get a 200 error, and you saw right down below it says login successful, welcome. And if we look at the network tab, here's the payload, all information, Brett Gmail, Brett, and then password 12345 6. The response that we sent back, which was the user, is all of this, and we also get underscore ID, which does mean that we successfully sent this information to the database, because that is the ID that we use inside of MongoDB. 200, okay, post, and then the request URL is from the localhost 8000/register. And just to check, we'll browse the collection. There should be a users, and then here is our information. So that is a lot of information to intake. If you're missing out or you're just confused about anything, rewatch the video, or you could also comment in the comment section and ask me a question, and I will try to get back with you within 24 hours. If not, you could also follow my social medias on my account, and also subscribe to me, because then you could always follow me. But we are going to keep going here, and we have done a lot of progress so far, and we are just going to make sure before we even keep continuing that all these errors work. So I'm not going to enter a name. I'm going to enter brett1@gmail.com, and I'm just going to enter some random password. So this should pop up. Let me take this out. This should pop up right here to the right, and it should say no name is required, or something like that. Name is required, as you see right there. So now let me enter a name. Let's use the same email to make sure that's working, and then we could use a different password. That's fine. Email is already taken, so that means that our backend API checked our database to see if this email is in there, and if it is, it sent us that message. And then let's just do a password like 12345. Let's do email that we haven't used, and it should say something about the password. Password is required, should be at least 6 characters long. So it looks like everything is working perfectly as it should. So the next step we are going to do is we should be creating, let me make sure everything's good. We should be creating the login endpoint. So if they want to log in, or we could actually hash the password, which I think we should hash the password first with Bcrypt before we even do the login endpoint. So let's do that to start next. Okay, so let's install Bcrypt onto our application in the backend server. You're just going to type npm I Bcrypt. You could check the package JSON. The dependency Bcrypt version 5.1 is there. So the main reason we want Bcrypt is to hash our user's password. This is because even though we are sending information to a secure database, it does add a layer of protection to the user and their account. So this hashes the password so that only the user knows and not even the database knows. Another way we are going to use Bcrypt is we are going to have to compare the passwords when somebody logs in to make sure they're logging in with the correct password. So we're going to compare the password that was typed to the encrypted hashed password, and we're going to do that as well using Bcrypt. So inside of the server, we're going to create a new folder or directory, and this is going to be helpers. In this helpers, we're going to create a new file called auth.js, and inside this file, we must import Bcrypt at the top. And at the top, we are going to create a function called hash password. This is going to take in parameter of password, and it's going to be an arrow function, and all we are going to do is return a new promise. And this new promise is going to have a resolve and reject. And Bcrypt does come with properties that allow us to use its functionality. So the first one is bcrypt.gensalt. So this is just going to increase the security of your actual hashed password. The default value is 10, but we are going to put 12. The higher the value, the more secured it is, but the longer it also takes to process, is what I am familiar with. And then we're going to pass in two properties in there. And then we are just going to have an if statement. So if there is an error, we're just going to reject it. So we could reject it right away. So reject, and then reject the error. And then right under that, we are going to have bcrypt as well again. And this time we could check all the suggested stuff it gives us. So we're going to actually hash this time. So we're going to hash the password. We're going to use salt, which is a parameter that they use. And then we are going to pass in error and hash. This gives you an arrow function, and right off the bat, we want to throw any new errors and reject them. And then if we don't have any, we are just going to resolve the hash. And that's going to run this function right here, bcrypt.hash. Other than that, everything else looks pretty good. And I'm just going to create one more function since I am here, which we will call compare passwords. And this is going to be used for the login API. So we're going to have password and then hashed passed in as parameters. And then all we're going to do is return bcrypt.compare, which is a function they give us, and we are going to pass in the password and the hashed. And then now we need to export these two functions from this file so we can use them inside of our controller. So we're going to do module.exports equals hash password and compare password. Now we're going to have to import these as well. Now we're going to import these two functions, hash password and compare password, inside of our controller. So let's just go to the top, and we're going to do const curly braces hash password and compare password. And this is just going to come from that file. So /helpers/auth. Okay, so now we are going to use the hash password when we actually create the user and send it to the database, which is right here, create user and database. So instead of just sending the password, we are going to send the password that is going to be hashed. So above this, let's create a function called hashed password. And this will equal await hash password that we imported. So we have hashed and then hash. And then the parameter, we're going to hash the password of the actual password, if that makes sense. So that's what this function is doing. And then we just got to pass hashed password here. Okay, so it looks like everything is good. So let's test this out and make sure in the database it is hashed. So we're going to go to register. We'll do brett5@gmail.com, and then 1 2 3 4 5 6. Submit. Login successful. Welcome. We are going to refresh our database, and our password should be hashed, and there it is. So as you can see these passwords here, but then this password from the brett5@gmail is actually hashed. So the Bcrypt is pretty easy to implement. It's only a few lines of code. If you really want a better understanding of it, you could definitely read some articles and look at the documentation from their website. But that's just pretty much the basics of how you can use it really quick. So the next thing I do want to do is, since we have that and we have the compare password function already created, we are going to create the login endpoint. So what I want to do first is I do want to go to routes, because I always like starting in the routes. So we are going to go to routes, and then we are going to create another post request. So router.post, this endpoint is going to be /login. And then we are going to pass the function login user, which we have not created. We are always going to create this in the controllers. So we are going to go to the controller. And let me just do comments here real quick. So I'm just going to do register endpoint. And then right above here, we could do login endpoint. And then we're going to create the function. So const, and what did I call it? I called it login user. So login user equals a request and response into an arrow function. And let's export it. And then let's also import it so we have no errors. Because we have errors right now. Login user is not defined. So we are going to go to the route. And then just add a comma here and login user, since it is from the same page. And it looks like everything is working correctly. So let's actually start creating the login API endpoint. So the first thing I am going to do is I'm going to create a try catch block. Oh, spelled it wrong. Try catch. And inside this try, the first thing we need is we need the requested body. So we are going to say const, and then it's going to be destructured with the email and password equals the requested body. So we are taking the email and password that they log in with, and then we just need to run a few checks as well, just almost like the register page. So we are going to check if user exists. So that's the first thing we need to do. And the way you check if user exists is we're going to make sure we find that email, and if it's good, then we're good to go. So we are just going to say const user equals await. So if we do await here, always make sure you have a sync up top or you're going to get errors. User dot find one, and it's going to find what, an email. So if there is no user, so if that means if there's no user, nobody's registered underneath that email, then we got to say we did not find that email. That means you're logging in with an invalid email. So what we could say is error, no user found. So that's going to check if the user exists. Next thing we need to do is obviously we check the email. Now this is where we're going to check the password. And we need to check if passwords match. So that's what we need to check for the login API point. So we just need to create a variable or a function called match. We're going to do an await compare password, which we imported from up here from the helpers folder. And then we need to pass in parameters. The first one is going to be the password. As you can see, as you type, it shows you it's the password. And then the second one is going to be the hashed password. And that is going to be the user. Let me show you how it is. It's user dot, and then it'll be password. That's where we're getting that from. So it's whatever this password is from the requested body, and then it's going to compare it to the user dot password when we created it in the register endpoint. And that's going to be in the database. So let's just do a quick if match. So that means if compare passwords is true, we need to do something. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign this a JSONWebToken. So if the matches are true and the email exists, that means we need to assign a web token, which is a cookie essentially, to this user so we could track them throughout the whole application. Other than that, we are going to, let's add a console log inside of the catch just with an error. And let's just return a res.json passwords match. So let's just make sure all of this works. So let's test the login endpoint in the front, which is right here. So let's go to login. I used brett5@gmail.com. And actually, before I do this, we never even set up the login front end endpoint to actually connect it. So we have to do that real quick. So let's make sure we do that before we even test it, because it's not going to work. So we're going to go to client, source, pages, login. And as you can see, we just have an axios.get request here. We actually need to do the post request, not put, post. So first we are going to destructure the data with email and password. And this is just going to equal data. Okay. Then we're going to have a try catch block below this. So inside of the try, we're going to take that destructured data, right? And we're going to wait async. We're going to wait axios.post, and the endpoint that we created is /login, and we created that here inside of our routes on the server side. So that is the endpoint, and then we also need to pass in a payload, which is the information. So email and then password. So that's how you take care of that. And now we're going to do some data checks with Toast. So we need to import Toast from React hot toast. And now we are going to be able to display those errors on the UI side. So for that, we're going to say if data.error, then we want to do a toast.error of that data.error, which is what we typed in for the errors in the backend. Else, we are going to set the data to an empty string. So reset the form. I mean, not empty string, empty object. We will reset the form to its default value. And we are going to need to import use navigate from React Router DOM. And then we're going to initialize it. And then we just want to navigate to the home page. Let's say that. Okay, so everything should be working that we need to work. Let's just refresh console, no errors. We are going to go to the network tab, log in. So we're going to use brett5@gmail.com. I think the password I typed was 123456. We will log in. It takes us actually to the home page, and we get 200 requests saying passwords match. So everything looks like it's working, and instead of obviously doing the passwords match, we are going to set up a cookie with the specific user so we could actually track them. And we are going to use, like I said, the JSONWebToken. And as you can see, the request URL endpoint is localhost 8000/login. It's a post request, a 200 status OK. And now let me try an error. So we're going to do brett5@gmail.com. I am going to start typing in some random stuff here in the login. And we are not getting an error, but we're also not getting a passwords don't match. We should be getting an error that say passwords do not match. So let's check that out real quick. So if we go back into our controllers if match. Oh, we actually never set one up. So we're going to say if no match. If they don't match, then we need to do a response.json with an error. And this error is going to say passwords do not match. All right, so let's try that now. So we try to log in. Passwords do not match, as you can see right here. And then if we type in, say, Brett 15, it's going to check that first, and it's going to say no user found. So it goes based on how you typed your code. But that's going to be the basis of the login endpoint and register user endpoint. Next thing we are going to do is we're going to create this JSONWebToken, import it, install it, and set it up correctly so we can start tracking our users and kind of create a mini dashboard for them. Okay, so when we do this JSONWebToken, we need to install 2 packages on our server. So the first package I am going to install is JSONWebToken. Like I said, this allows us to implement cookies to specific users and track them throughout the site. And we just use that for useful tasks and better UI. And another thing we want is we want a cookie parser, because we are not going to be able to actually use their information if we don't have this cookie parser. So we're just going to put npm install JSONWebToken and cookie parser. And make sure you're installing it on the server. And now we could get ready to start it. So we are going to set up some middleware inside of our index.js. And we're just going to do app.use. But before we do that, let me import what I need at the top, which is going to be the cookie parser. So we can name this cookie parser equals require, and then cookie parser. So we're going to use this cookie parser. So we named a cookie parser, initialize it. That's going to allow the cookies to be going back from one host to another. And let's just do one more middleware, and this is going to be express.url encoded, and then we're going to do extended false. So these are the 2 middlewares that we're going to need to use for these JSONWebTokens. So now for the JSONWebTokens, we are going to do this all inside of our auth controller. So at the top, we have to import it. So we're going to do const, and we're going to call this JWT equals require JSONWebToken. So that means we imported it at the top. And now we are going to just give a JSONWebToken inside of the login. Only the login API endpoint, not the register. So after they register, we do want them to re-log back in. I feel like that's how most applications work. And if you don't, then you usually send them an email trying to confirm their email address. But for this project, we're just going to create the JWT inside of the login endpoint. And we're going to do it right here if the passwords match. So what we can do is we could just do JWT. That's what we assigned it. And we could do a parameter or like a function called sign. This is going to sign the token. And we could sign it so we're the only ones who actually knows what's going on, and we're going to have to actually create a secret for this sign. So what we can do now is we can do the email, which will be user.email. We could have the ID, which will be user._ID, because that's how it is in MongoDB, _ID. And then we could also have user.name. This is the information that we are going to send throughout the cookie. And then we're going to have another parameter, and this parameter right next to us, this is going to be the secret. Pretty much the JSONWebToken secret, and this needs to be created in the env file. So when we go to the env file, we could create whatever string secret we want as long as nobody else knows what it is. So I'm just going to do JWT underscore secret equals and then start typing random stuff. Like, it really doesn't matter what it is. So that is going to be the second parameter pass. So we're going to do process.env.jwt underscore secret. And since we did do a change inside of an env file, let's just restart the server. And we can start it back up. We are getting an error. We could work on fixing that later, but we'll see what happens as we keep coding. So after we get that JWT secret, we need a third parameter, which is going to be an empty object. And then the fourth is going to be an anonymous function that's going to take an error and a token. And this error and token is going to be a callback function that's going to have if error. We're just going to throw it off the bat. So if there's any errors, we're just going to throw those errors. And then what we are going to do here is we're going to send a cookie. So res.cookie. And this will be a token. That's what we're going to call it as the first parameter. And it's actually going to be the token. And this could be .json user. So what we are doing here is we are setting everything up to how it should be. Let's see what error we are getting. So the error we are getting is JWT, we're getting user.name error. The reason why is because we didn't define name before it. So now we should be good. So everything looks good. Next, we are going to test out the JWT token and make sure everything is right here. So right now, everything looks pretty good. Let me just minimize this terminal a little bit. And let's actually log in and test to see if we are sending this cookie. So let me open back up the VS Code, go back to our front end. Let me refresh, make sure we're in login, and we're going to log in with that brett5@gmail.com. And we're going to enter a password of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This means passwords match, and it should run that JWT sign. So as you can see, we get the 200. Oh. It looks like we're passing the ID, the password that's hashed, all that. If we look inside the headers, we do get a set cookie, and we are setting it to a token. So we are getting a response of a cookie. We just don't have it in the request. So we definitely need to work on that, and we can look through the code to see what is going on about that. Okay, so I just refreshed the page and I wanted to test out to see if we got the cookie again, and it actually works this time. I just want to show you guys it does. So I'm just going to refresh this. We're going to log in. We're going to get brett5@gmail.com. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Log in. We get a 200 request. And then if you could look in the response, we get a set cookie, and in the request, we actually get a token that equals that long string. So we are sending the cookie correctly into our user. So next thing we want to do is we want to actually be able to access this cookie and token throughout the whole application. So to do that, we are going to create some context. And this context is going to be created in the front end. So let me minimize this, minimize the server. We could exit out of a bunch of pages. Create a new folder inside of a client called context. And then we are going to call this user context.jsx. So for this user context JSX, we will import Axios from Axios. And then we're going to import create context from React. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to export const. We're going to call this user context. And this is going to equal the create context, and it'll be an empty object. So after we do that, we are going to export function user context provider. So we're going to have to wrap the whole application with the provider. So the provider takes in all the children as a parameter. And then inside of this is where we could run all of our code if we need to, that we want applied to the whole application. So for now, we could just do a return. And what we're going to return is user context dot provider. And like I said, the provider, it's going to apply to all the children. And the children, we are going to send values to all these children so we could use them. So you're pretty much going to send like state down throughout the whole application. So you don't have to send state back up the application, because that's harder to send application and state down. So this allows you to access state anywhere within your application, and you'll see how that works. So what we want to do is we want a user and we want a set user. So we are going to need some use state, and then we also want use effect. So you'll see how we use these two hooks from React right here. So right above the return, we are going to have a user and a set user. And this is going to equal use state. And the initial value is just going to be null. There's going to be no user, because we're going to assume nobody's logged in. Then we are going to have a use effect. And this will fire off every time a page renders, pretty much, essentially. So every time you go on a different page, we're going to be able to tell if there is a user or if there's not. So if there is no user, not one user, if there's no user, then we are going to do Axios dot, and then we need a get endpoint, because we want to actually be able to get the user. So we could just create this real quick for this. We're going to say /profile as the endpoint for this API. And then we could just do a .then. And the reason why I'm doing a then instead of anything else is because you don't want to use a sync and a wait inside of a use effect. So we're going to do data, and the data is going to be wrapped in an object. And this data is going to be set to an arrow function. And we're going to set the user to data. So as you can see, everything here looks pretty good. And then we just got to add at the end of the use effect, we have to add an empty array dependency. And then for the values, we want to pass the user and set user. All right, so we have this context set up that now we could use throughout the whole application. The way you could do that is we have to wrap everything in a user context provider. So we could go inside of the app.jsx, and we could import user context provider from that file. And what we're going to do here is we are just, instead of these backticks, we could just do, not backticks, fragments. We could do user context provider wrapped, and then this will just be at the very bottom. And then we could just get rid of this. So our whole application now is wrapped with this context provider, allowing us to use the state that we defined inside of the context. And this state is always going to apply, and the use effect always starts when a new page renders. So that's how we're going to do this, but we don't have this endpoint created yet. So let's go ahead and create that endpoint in the backend. So first thing is first, let's close the client, open the server. We will go to routes, auth routes, and we're going to create a GET request now. So we're going to do router.get, and we are going to have that endpoint that we created, which will be profile, which technically we're creating right now. In that profile, we need to create a function for, and we're going to call this get profile, and we're going to create the function in the auth controller. We can do this at the bottom. So we're going to do const get profile equals request response into an arrow function, and then let's export it so we stop getting this error. Get profile, and then let's import it inside of the routes, comma get profile. We should get no errors now, so we have no errors. So now let's actually go back into the auth controller and create this endpoint. So we're going to have const token, and this token is going to be the required cookies. So this token is going to be whatever the requested cookies are going to be, and that is going to be right here, this cookie right here, this token. It's in the request headers. You can see that inside of your network tab. So inside of your network tab, you're going to have that, and then we're going to do if statements to see if certain things are right. So if there is a token, that's what it's saying. If we have a token, we could do a JWT, and we could verify the JSONWebToken to make sure it's legit and it's the right one. So we're going to pass the first parameter as the token. It tells you right here. This is for the verify function that JSONWebToken provides. So the token is a string, which we passed in right here. Then we have the secret or public key, which is the JWT secret. So it's going to be JWT underscore secret. And then it's actually going to be process.env.jwt secret, because that's coming from the environment variable. The next one is we are going to do an empty, we're going to have options, which is going to be technically an empty object because we're not going to pass any through. And then we are going to have an anonymous function that passes an error and a user. So we are going to say right off the bat, if there's an error, we are going to throw error. Other than that, we're going to respond with JSON of user. So that's going to give us back the user every time this function runs, which will be every time a page loads, since we're using the use effect in the front end. Other than that, we're going to have an else statement. We're just going to respond with a JSON of null. So everything looks good in this API endpoint of get profile. Let me just open up our front end real quick, and I'm just going to reload the page, and you're going to see profile right here. It says profile of 200. It's a get request of OK 200. It gives us the email, IAT, which is like the issued at time, and that's like coded in a certain way to be a specific time. It gives us the name and the ID. And as you can see in the response, there's our response, which is the user, which is email, ID, name, and issued at time. You could go to cookies. It shows you the cookie value. Headers, it shows us this. And if I refresh the page, it still should be there. So if we're getting a profile, it still shows brett5@gmail.com, even though it doesn't display on the UI side. So let me just review that really quickly, just so you guys get a very good understanding of what's going on. So first thing is first, you can create an endpoint called get profile with the get request. The route is a router.get, using the endpoint profile and using the function get profile right here. We are taking the token from the requested cookies, and we get the token because we're using a JSONWebToken right here, where we're assigning it with the email, ID, and name. We are passing all the right parameters we need for this JWT sign. And then this profile endpoint is verifying that JSONWebToken. Now, if you go over to the front end, we are using context from React so the whole application can receive this state. And we are going to set the user and set user so we can always have a user on any page we go to if they are logged in. If they're not logged in, you're going to get no user. So we're using the use effect, and if there is no user found, we are going to use axios.get step endpoint, and then if that's true, then we're going to send that data to set user, which is going to be data, which the new user will be everything the data is, which is the name, email, and issued at time, and whatever you pass through. The provider covers everything within the children, and the value is going to be the user and set user. And we wrap the whole application right here in the app.jsx with the user context provider. So now the next step is, if you want to access, right, like the username, this is how we will do it. So I'm going to create a new page. I'm going to create this page. Yeah. I'm going to create this page, and this page name will be dashboard.jsx. We will do RFC. And for this dashboard, we are going to have to import a few things real quick. So import, use context from React. And then we also exported user context from this specific file. So now this dashboard is going to act like a dashboard if somebody's actually logged in. So if they're not logged in, they're not going to really be able to see their name on the dashboard. So to access the user value, we just call the user in curly braces, and we use context from the user context. And that's how you're going to write it. So if you ever want to access the user in any page, you have to call this right at the top above the return. So inside of the return, we could have a div, and then inside that div we could have h1 saying dashboard, right? And then right below that h1 we could have JSX syntax with the curly brace, and this is going to say if there is a user, wait to see if there's a user, and if that's true, we will have, let's say, an h2, right? That's going to say hi user, and then if we want to access the name, dot name, and then we'll do an exclamation mark. And the reason why I'm saying user dot name is because the user is what we set that to be, and then you can see all the properties here. So it'll be like user dot email, user dot ID, user dot name. And you could add a lot more stuff depending on what you want them to submit in the form. So that should work. So let's test this out. We're going to log in with Brett. Actually, before we do that, we got to send after the login. We're going to navigate to /dashboard. And then we actually have to create this dashboard right inside of the app.jsx because we don't have a route to it. So let's just copy this down. It'll be dashboard, and the element it is going to go to is dashboard, and it imports automatically up top. Now everything should work. So let's try this out. So brett5@gmail.com. Password will be 123456. Login, dashboard, and we are not getting the name. So let's make sure we have everything that we need. So the profile get request is getting us a 200. The name, all that stuff looks good. it does say dashboard / dashboard, but it's not giving us the name. So let's make sure all this is right. So we have an H2. We have a use context and a user context. Everything looks pretty good. Let me wrap it maybe in fragments to see if that makes a difference. Let's try it again. So if we refresh, let's try login again, brett5@gmail.com. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We log in, it just says dashboard. Maybe there is no H2. Let's try it as a H1. Because I left the global CSS on and index CSS on, so maybe that could be what's messing around with it. So if we refresh it, still looks like nothing. Okay, let me review the code real quick and I will record this right back. Okay, so usually when you're coding, you understand that if you miss a single letter or curly brace, that it definitely affects your code, and that's what happened here. So what happened here was that in the use context, I just retraced my steps back. Obviously, the problem is it wasn't popping up the user, so it had to be something in the user context or the dashboard. The backend was working. I was getting 200s. It was showing me all the data. So I wasn't passing the values properly to the user context.provider. I only had one curly brace. You need two because it's technically an object. So I only had one here, but you need to make sure two are here or you're not going to be able to see the user in your code. And if you guys want to see the dashboard code again, here it is right there. And we are going to try this out again, and then it says dashboard hybrid. So that is the whole application. Let me just Control C real quick. Yes. And then we are going to stop the development server real quick. So I'm going to do npm run dev. We're going to open up a new localhost 5173. Okay. And we are going to start the server on the back end. So npm start. So our front end and back end is now running. And I just want to take you through the front and back of how somebody will actually be using this on your application. So you can style this how you want, but here's the nav bar. We are going to register. And on the register, I'm going to put Brett as my name. Brett6@gmail.com as my email, and the password I'm gonna do is 1 2 3 4 5 6. So if we click submit, we got a login successful, welcome. So now we are redirected automatically to the login page. We are going to check our database. Our database does show brett6@gmail.com with the hashed password, hashing it out so it's protected even more. We are going to go back to the front end, and now we are going to log in with brett6@gmail.com. Password 1 2 3 4 5 6. We are going to log in, and we are taken directly to the dashboard. And if we refresh the page, it says hi Brett. So other than that, that is how you can create a very effective MERN stack with the register and login function that uses JSONWebToken, uses Bcrypt, uses React Hot Toast, uses use context, state, effect, use effect, a bunch of hooks. This was a really, really long tutorial, but I hope you stuck through it. There's a lot of valuable things in there. And if you do have any trouble with any of these concepts, You can go back to this video. There is timestamps below. If you're even having more trouble, there's plenty of documentations. You could leave a comment for me. I'll try to get back within 24 hours. But other than that, thank you for staying for the whole video. Thank you for listening to me. It'll be meaning the world to me if you guys could subscribe and also hit that like button so it can motivate me to make even more videos. But other than that, good luck with everything and happy coding.